Good afternoon and hello from around the world. Welcome to EDNews. My name is Akbar Novruz, and today joining us live is a special guest joining us from UK, journalist and a political expert on international relations, Mr. Neil Watson. I welcome you to our program, Mr. Neil.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a great honor to be here.
Thank you as well. As we all know, in the last couple of weeks, we had a pretty stacked political agenda, I would say. And the first question I would like to ask you is about the landmine problems in Azerbaijan. In the last few days, landmine incidents have occurred again in the territories of Azerbaijan. Mine incidents were actually recorded in the districts of Agdam, Shusha, and Nakhchivan. And my questions are actually about why is Azerbaijan's landmine problem currently not discussed at the international level? And in addition, positive dynamics have been observed in the relations with Armenia recently, as you all know. But why doesn't the Armenian side present the mine maps to us, to Azerbaijan, of course?
Well, I think there's many reasons why, unfortunately, the mine situation is not discussed enough in the UN, NATO, and other European institutions or worldwide institutions. First of all, I think that there is still a general lack of general knowledge about the realities, first of all, of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union itself, and how the countries have either worked together or, in the case of Azerbaijan, Armenia, have actually fought against each other, and the underlying causes of that, and also who the interested players are in these conflicts, these so-called frozen conflicts, which of course were never actually frozen at all. And I think that there's also the issue, of course, that Armenia itself is very, very much better at putting its case across on an international level. First of all, there is the fact that, of course, naturally, Armenia is a Christian country and badges itself very much as being a Christian country, and badges the conflict as being a conflict with a religious basis attached to it. Obviously, forgetting about Azerbaijan's inherent multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity. I think that Armenia is just very, very good at getting people to actually understand its reasons and also its motivations as well. And then there's also, of course, the impact of the international Armenian diaspora, particularly in France, which plays a very significant role both within the EU and the United States. In terms of politics, in terms of actually having very wealthy and influential Armenians in very leading positions of power. And the fact is that the Armenians have actually been migrating to the West for over 1 century since the alleged events of 1915, and indeed before that. So I think that their perspective, which of course we all know is incorrect, their perspective is very much more understood than the Azerbaijani perspective. And I would say that we do need to be more proactive. I think there is an issue that Azerbaijanis and their sympathizers, such as myself, we do tend to actually talk amongst ourselves, and we agree about everything. It's the fact that we need to have some good politicians, and we need to do some good lobbying at an international level to make the Azerbaijani perspective, the Azerbaijani standing in international law, understood. And the landmine issue is something that landmines, first of all, are the most indiscriminate kind of weapon. They actually remain in the ground. Of course, they are planted during a conflict, during the case of this one, 30 years of conflict. Indeed, I've been to Agdam and to Shusha myself, and I've actually seen the extent of the landmine issue. It's the major problem that's actually holding Azerbaijan back from rebuilding and reconstructing its liberated territories at the moment. We have 30 years of landmines in the grounds. Obviously, the earlier ones are now reaching a state of degradation because they've been exposed to the elements for such a time. They're very, very volatile at the moment. But then there's also the landmines that were planted. In the case of Agdam, it was used as a buffer zone, for example, the landmines that were planted during the 30 years of occupation. And then also, when the Armenians actually, after the 10th of December 2020 tripartite ceasefire was signed, then there were more landmines that were actually planted in the territories when the Armenians knew that they were going to have to vacate. So they're kind of almost like booby traps that they left behind. The fact that they did this, first of all, after the ceasefire, indicates that Armenia, certainly at that point in time, was certainly not interested at all in actually getting any kind of peace. I've always been of the view that Pashinyan, despite all his failings, actually in his heart knows that the way forward for his country is peace, but he's been manifestly unsuccessful in actually persuading his population and also the diaspora to actually understand this. And he says inherently different things regardless of his audience, whether it's an international audience or whether it's a homegrown audience, because he does know that at home he's quite unpopular because he's seen to be the man who actually lost Karabakh. And furthermore, of course, there's the fact that latterly he's actually lost the support of Russia. The great supporter of Armenia over the last 30 years has indeed been, first of all, the Soviet Union, and then, of course, Russia itself. So the fact that he's actually lost this and now gone towards the EU in a very forlorn attempt to actually try and get some international support from a different region means that he's actually lost a lot of the support of his own population. I think with regard to the presentation of the mind maps themselves, first of all, there are questions in my mind as to whether actually accurate mind maps actually existed in the first place. Certainly in places like Agdan, where the Armenians did not live themselves, there was no real reason for them to accurately produce mind maps even for their own purposes. They've also been very reluctant, of course, to produce mind maps for some of the other liberated territories, such as Shusha, and I'm given to understand that the accuracy is often as low as 20%. I think they're just trying to be difficult. I think that they are trying to vacillate. They are trying to protract the peace process as long as possible. And I think in the case of Pashinyan himself, he hopes that somehow he can kind of extend the peace process as long as it's necessary, so that by the time somebody in the dim and distant future comes to sort it out, it's not going to be him, because ultimately a peace treaty is going to have to be signed between the countries. I think that it's just a way of just causing this process to go on ad infinitum. He's hoping that something will change. He's hoping he's going to get EU and NATO support. The fact that Azerbaijan, certainly very brief time, came very close to Russia, didn't actually help Azerbaijan's standing in the international sphere. Now Azerbaijan, of course, has gone against that, and actually it looks as if the Russian so-called peacekeepers are actually going to leave the territory. But for a while it looked as if Armenia could be seen as getting close to the EU, Azerbaijan getting close to Russia. Of course, Russia being the great pariah at the moment because of the situation over Ukraine. I think now he's going to use the increased proximity to the EU and to the US, where there have been I understand there's been some military maneuvers that have been masterminded by the US, just to try and make the Armenian perspective better understood, as I said at the outset, and really to get in the way of Azerbaijan from getting its perspective put across. Certainly, I think, as I said to you earlier, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding the EU. I also think amongst the former Soviet republics, apart from the friendly former Soviet republics in Central Asia, I think there is still this view that Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis are a kind of, they're a very volatile nation. They are seen to be the aggressor, despite the realities of international politics and international law. And Azerbaijan does have a very long way to go in making its very rightful perspective understood by the international community. And that is the reason why, in my view, actually, it is much better now that the peace talks are taking place in a purely bilateral format, because before then we had the interested parties of Russia, United States, and then the EU, which unfortunately France very much played an integral role in that not working out. All those kind of those programs have actually come to an end. Now Azerbaijan and Armenia are talking explicitly together. But the fact is that Armenia, although it has lost the support of Russia, it does still very much have Iran on its side, and that is a major issue for Azerbaijan at the moment, that Armenia has got the support, I think, in many ways of the West, and has got the ear of the West particularly. And, you know, we've had France even promising to support Armenia militaristically, but also it does have Iran on its side because of the unrelated issue between Azerbaijan and Iran. So it's a very complex situation we have at the moment. And I can only say yet again that Azerbaijan needs to be more proactive at putting its perspective across and getting the international community to put added pressure on Armenia to actually go forward and sign the peace process. We are very close, but it's still that for those final few centimeters are proving very difficult to overcome. And Pashinyan, because of his vacillating nature, the fact that in many ways he's not even a professional politician, he was a journalist like myself before getting into this role. And he knows what to say to the right faction, and he hopes that people won't add things up. But ultimately, he comes across as being weak, and that is also not helpful, because Armenia really needs to have a strong leader who will not necessarily just go with the prevailing flow and latch on like the drowning man to a straw. He actually needs to be a strong leader who will actually take that one step further towards Azerbaijan and Armenia coming together, because ultimately this is going to be better for Armenia. It's going to mean that Armenia is going to finally get its true independence away from being in the shadow of Russia. And also we end up with a more cohesive South Caucasus, which is for the better of all populations, including the Armenians who are actually living in Azerbaijan, and the region as a whole, with greater connectivity going on, which is something that Azerbaijan is certainly trying to spearhead at the moment.
Oh, by the way, thank you for your great answer. And I would like to ask in addition,
Sure.
Do you think that as a resolution, can we actually invite third-party countries or organizations into the region to make them actually invite them to see the current processes, how the process is actually going in Karabakh, how terrible the current mining situation in Karabakh? Do you think like that?
Yes, I think that, and that's an extremely good point, because it leads me on to something else. It's the fact is that I think that the way to approach this often is from the purely humanitarian aspect. And certainly I was at an event in the British Parliament just under 3 months ago, which specifically focused on this. It was organised one of the all-party parliamentary groups to do with unexploded ordnances, which of course mines the majority of unexploded ordnances. And indeed, we had a spokesman from Anamar there, and we also had some third parties who were actually involved in doing some of the demining processes in the liberated territories, and including those using dogs and rats and so forth, which was absolutely fascinating. And I think that that is a very good way to approach it, is actually to invite the international organizations, particularly those to do with unexploded ordnances, demining, and indeed to do with trying to get peace around the world, like the International United Peace Federation, you know, to actually get them to come along and see the situation on the ground. What it's very important to do, however, is keep the talks but purely bilateral, because that's only there that we're going to see any headway. We always end up with a third-party organisation or country which has got vested interests, and they are only going to pour oil on troubled waters with regard to the peace process itself. So I think that, yes, come at it from the humanitarian perspective, that's very, very positive, because I've always been of the view that humanity's got a lot more in common than there are differences. Step away from any religious issues, but don't actually get any organizations that could even be more obstreperous in actually getting peace.
Great, thank you. So my next question will be another question regarding Azerbaijan. As we all know, Russian peacekeeping contingent have actually started to withdraw from the region of Karabakh. So they were actually expected to leave the region in 2025, but an early withdrawal decision have been made from Kremlin. How do you assess the withdrawal decision?
Well, I think that this is, first of all, I think this is a victory for long-term strategic planning by your President Aliyev and the Milli Majlis, because this he's used the concept of Russian expansionism, the desire for Russia to maintain some kind of situation within the South Caucasus, some kind of controlling situation in the South Caucasus to their ultimate advantage. Because obviously, with the situation that arose in 2020, Armenia was already stepping away from Russia itself. Obviously, Armenia had been the Russian foothold in the South Caucasus up to that point. And I do believe that Russia played an integral role in the tripartite ceasefire. They could see clearly, first of all, they backed off from actually providing Armenia with any military support, clear military support. Obviously, there were 30 years of armaments and landmines that have been provided by Russia to Armenia to keep this whole thing going, because Armenia can do nothing on its own. But the fact is that they saw that without a ceasefire, Azerbaijan quite potentially could take back further than just Karabakh and the 7 surrounding regions. It actually could go back, and it could take back all the ancient historic Azerbaijani regions, including Yerevan itself, which we all know was Yerevan Khanate if we go back long enough. So they actually played an integral role in creating the ceasefire in the first place. To placate the Russians, obviously they were allowed to have their so-called peacekeepers on Azerbaijani territory. It was extremely unpopular amongst the mass of the Azerbaijani population, and quite understandably so, because up to that point it had been just about, if not the only former Soviet republic that had not had any Russian armaments or bases on its soil. But then there were all kinds of issues, and we must remember all the standoff that went on the Lachin Road, the situation with Armenians continuing to exploit Azerbaijani resources and so forth. Then, of course, late last year, I believe in September last year, there was the fact that Azerbaijan quite rightly took back Khan Kendi and routed the remains of the unrecognized illegal Armenian regime that was remaining headquartered there. I think that proved again to Russia itself that it was losing its position in the South Caucasus. And that, in fact, also with the concurrent situation, and then, of course, the peace treaty, the peace talks that were taking place under the aegis of the Kremlin, those came to an end because there's no way that Russia can actually be part of any peace talks at the moment, given the situation that's happening with Ukraine. There's also been a certain amount of Azerbaijani support for Ukraine as well, albeit not militaristically, but certainly in a humanitarian level. Russia realizes that although they have to work together on some level, certainly in terms of business, actually, it's a forlorn hope. Azerbaijan is a very independent former Soviet republic, and it's never, ever going to be as close a friend, and never needs to be as close a friend of Russia as Armenia needed to be. And then there's also the fact that the situation with Ukraine is continuing a lot longer than President Putin ever thought it was going to. And he needs to have professional soldiers back on fighting in that war, if indeed that is going to continue. It's a waste of their time, it's a waste of their resources, it's a waste of their armaments to actually be doing the so-called peacekeeping, when actually it's not serving any real purpose in maintaining any kind of Russian stranglehold over the South Caucasus. So it's very good that, as I say, your president, the Milli Majlis, and the military commanders have actually understood the Russian psychology, which of course they understand very, very well, having been 70 years within the Soviet Union, and then has actually realized that this is the time to actually let them peacefully withdraw. And it means that the way is open yet again for Azerbaijan and Armenia to have bilateral diplomacy going on here. And this can only be good, because Armenia was without the support of Russia at the moment. Yes, in the background, we got the support of Iran, but we'll come on to the question later. But Iran is rather tied up with something else that's going on at the moment in the Middle East. So I think that certainly when it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan being together in a room, we know who the strong country is, who's actually got the cards in their favor. It's Azerbaijan. So I think this is a very, very good move indeed.
So do you think that they're actually using reverse psychology in order to gain influence in the region?
Yes,
Not like
exactly.
putting the army, so they're actually being more friendly and having international, economical and political relationship with Azerbaijan.
Yes, I mean a good economic and political relationship with Azerbaijan can only be good. The fact is that Russia itself needs countries that it can do business with. It's getting more and more problems because of the sanctions that
Yeah,
have
with the
been
sanctions,
placed
yes.
upon it. You know, really, in many ways, it's only the other prior states of Iran and of North Korea that are actually supporting Russia at the moment. And of course, there's the relationship with China as well. China obviously does business with all countries, but also since the sanctions started nearly 10 years ago, in the light of the Crimea situation, really it's been the relationship with China, which also, of course, has a Soviet basis. That has actually kept going. So I think that they realise that actually having a good, healthy relationship with Azerbaijan, albeit not militaristically, and nowhere near, it can never be as strong as it was with Armenia, which was out of need, of course, is much, much better. And it means that Russia can be part of the dynamics of the region to some extent in the future, but certainly not control them.
Thank you. And so you mentioned about a fact that the Ukraine war has been going pretty long. I would say much longer than everyone expected. So the current state, as I have read earlier, that the tension between NATO and Russia has reached a nuclear threat. As it was reported that NATO may actually deploy nuclear weapons in Poland, and the president of the Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda, stated in his latest interview to a Polish publication, saying that NATO allies are ready to deploy nuclear weapons on their territory, and if they consider it necessary, we are accepting it, and we are looking pretty good for that decision. So do you think, as it happened before in 1962 during the Cold War, could a second 1962 nuclear crisis scenario happen due to Poland, America deploying like nuclear weapons to Poland, or Russia having like making any other alliances in the, I would say, like South Balkan countries, Balkanic countries, or maybe Middle East region? Can they actually deploy any nuclear weapons in the region?
I think that it's not as serious a situation as the Bay of Pigs incident that we're talking about, 1962. Then we had mutually assured destruction. We did actually have the two sides with enough nuclear capability to destroy each other and collectively destroy the world. We're not of that level. We have to remember that since the fall of the Soviet Union, there has been a great deal of downscaling of nuclear weaponry, and that public opinion on the whole around the world is against nuclear weaponry. What we are seeing, however, a lot of posing going on. We're seeing a lot of frustration going on. I think that the West is disappointed with the impasse that we've seen, because I can't see the sides coming together on any level at the moment, and that's why the rhetoric is getting more and more heightened, as you say quite correctly, from Poland, but also from Baltic states, and particularly from countries like Estonia at the moment, which obviously were part of the former Soviet Union, are actually their president is making some very, very great claims at the moment to be building fortifications and so forth near the Russian border. I think we are seeing frustration there. There's also the fact that we've not seen the West continuing to work together as cohesively as it should or could. We are not seeing a unified policy across all countries, particularly all those countries that were formerly either part of the Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact in the past, because they realized that Russia is a very, very volatile force. What I do not think, however, is that Russia is looking to do any greater expansionism anytime soon. The fact is that President Putin has seen his popularity ratings plummet because of the the situation in this country at the moment. We're seeing young men being conscripted. We are seeing, obviously, the impact of the sanctions being felt very, very strongly. Obviously, there's the impact on trade between Russia and other countries is very much curtailed at the moment. And I think even those Russians who originally may have supported the reasons for the war are now actually backing off from it because they realise that this has just gone on too long and the implications are too strong. But I think we are seeing a lot of saber rattling going on. We have to remember that in most wars, it's more about showing what you've got than actually using it.
Yes. Much is like probably Iran and Israel, let's say.
Most certainly. And these situations, they run on sometimes for decades. And I think that if Russia gets some of what it wants, which is possible, and NATO gets some of what it wants, and there can be some kind of understanding, then maybe that's where it will all end. But if Russia gets more than it actually anticipated out of Ukraine eventually, and because we're not seeing a cohesive Western response taking place, plus we're seeing that there is weaponry that's actually been depleted, and they do not have as much to offer Ukraine as they once had. We could, and if there is too much provocation that's taking place from Poland, from Estonia, actually from the Baltic states generally, even from Finland, then we could actually see some Russian expansionism actually taking place. But I think it's very, very unlikely. I think that there needs to be a great deal of face saving that goes on. I think that it's important for President Putin, for his popularity ratings, for his own ego, and also the fact that he's actually sent young men to their deaths in this conflict, that he needs to be justified on some level. And I think the same needs to be said of NATO as well. It needs to be seen to have actually rebuffed Russia to some extent. But I think that both sides are going to be very, very unwilling to unleash their nuclear arsenals over this. The other thing, of course, that is in the back of my mind is the fact that the other nuclear power, of course, and we have no idea exactly what they have, is Iran. But
yes.
As we are alluding to, is the fact that Iran is very much tied up in the situation with the Middle East at the moment. It will not be in a hurry to be fighting with its trained soldiers on two fronts at any one time. And certainly nuclear weapons are not easy things to deploy. It's all right to position them there, but you need to have people who can actually deploy them efficiently and effectively because they are sophisticated weaponry. And I think Russia on its own is also weakened with regard to its willingness to deploy nuclear arsenals. So I think that although there's a lot of saber rattling going on, we are showing what we've got, and of course we must not forget as well the fact that North Korea itself has also got nuclear weaponry, and I know that there is a lot of information sharing going on between North Korea and Russia at the moment. There have been meetings and so forth, but I think that it's just at the moment it's the sign of desperation on both sides, and particularly from NATO at the moment, that they're prepared to sort of bring this to the fore and to position these weapons where they are. They want there to be some kind of dialogue taking place. And actually, the way that I'm looking at the moment, there is no dialogue taking place behind the scenes, and maybe it will prompt that dialogue to actually take place. I think both sides are getting very, very tired.
Okay, thank you. But lastly, maybe I'm going to sound a bit more controversial to you or our viewers. I would like to see your opinion about it. Lastly, of course, we're going to talk about the full-scale war potential in the Middle East involving Iran and Israel. In my opinion, as you talked about, the nuclear threats are a problem, are a big problem, humanitarian problem that I would say, and I agree with that. But in my perspective, I think countries like Iran or Poland or any countries that are actually, let's say, bordered with Russia or bordered with Iran, having nuclear weapons can actually, let's say, it would actually, how do I say, intervene the making the full-scale war. I think it would actually stop the expansion and everyone would actually live in a peace. because they would actually get scared of, they would be afraid of nuclear threats, nuclear weapons, and most certainly. How do you think about that?
I think it's true. I mean, the fact is that nuclear weapons are the ultimate in weaponry. You know, we saw what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. The ramifications of using nuclear weaponry are absolutely huge, but they don't just affect the country. If they are used in a full-scale war, they don't just affect the country they're being aimed at. They affect entire regions of the world for decades afterwards. So yes, it's like having a gun in the room. It actually makes other people, because they can see the threat immediately in front of them, to actually realize what they're doing and the implications of this and the ultimate outcome. But I think there is still an unwillingness to actually use the nuclear armory, because the implications are just so huge. Obviously, in terms of the amount of indiscriminate deaths that take place, then there's the radiation that remains in a region for decades to come. And then there's also the fact that any country that uses nuclear weaponry at any point becomes a pariah for the world thereafter. I mean, people are still talking about the humanitarian issues that occurred with the Hiroshima nearly 80 years ago. And the fact that the US, as a so-called democratic nation, should never have ever used this weaponry, even if it did ultimately, in inverted commas, save lives. So I think there's a great deal of ethics around it. But yes, certainly it puts things into touch. It's the ultimate in weaponry. So I think that it's good that they are there in a way, but also it's very good if they are never ever used.
Of course, definitely.
And that their ultimate fate is to end up in some concrete bunker for the next few millennia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Neil. I am appreciated. I am glad that you have joined our program. That's actually our end of the program. I think it was a great interview. Thank you so much once again. See you in near future. Thank you so much.
It's my absolute pleasure. Daymez, and I wish you success for the rest of the day. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.